Alright everyone, I thought I'd make a video a little bit about explaining how censorship, number one, it doesn't progress in one single direction, number two, doesn't progress forever, it collapses in on itself, and number three, that the current era of censorship, while it is definitely bad, as all censorship invariably is, whether it's state-led or not, the very idea, the principle of preventing people from speaking lawfully is something that I'm deeply averse to and all other patriotic Americans should be. Despite that, I'd like to go back through U.S. history specifically and explain why none of those things are the case. Censorship has at times been arguably, technologically speaking, worse than it is currently. And it's directed at various groups. It doesn't have to be political groups. It can be religious movements. It can be social movements, individuals. As we see with Donald Trump at the moment, he's not in office currently, but still not allowed to use Facebook. Not that he fucking cares. And really it goes back to the Reconstruction period, and technically the Civil War. The suspension of certain ideas, well, technically you could say the Alien and Sedition Act under Adams starts it all just in the dawn of the United States. Right, Washington leaves, and the first thing that Adams does is, oh, you know what, if people criticize me, I'm going to throw them in jail. This is part of the reason Jefferson ended up destroying him afterwards when he ran against him. Jefferson, I believe, one of the greatest presidents. Adams, not so much, by the way. It's funny because people still rank him as a considerably above average president, but that's just because he happened to be the second fucking president. Alien and Sedition Act and a bunch of other shit that he did. Now, give Jefferson the credit for actually stabilizing things. No, but censorship technically begins there, but by and large, there was a significant aversion to it, and also the United States hadn't really been settled enough up until the Industrial Revolution to really have the machinations that would be needed for any significant censorship. You know, people living out in the woods and stuff, it's kind of hard to prevent them from saying what they want to say unless you want to put a bullet between their eyes. Most of the population, not even literate up until that period of time, by the way. I think literacy in the early United States was like, what, 30-40%? Pretty typical, pretty standard for the era. A little bit of a different story today. Now illiteracy is 99%. People have regressed. They use Twitter so much they can't even, pay attention to something for more than 30 seconds. Half the people have already turned the video off. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm being slightly hyperbolic. But if you look at like the Reconstruction period, a lot of the first true censorship is aimed at neo-Confederates with the idea, well, they're too dangerous, it's treasonous, so they're not allowed to speak. Then anarchists, actually, up through basically the early 1900s, that was the biggest group. Before even like communism, anarchists. Keep in mind McKinley was shot and killed by an anarchist, actually. And if I remember correctly, that individual had been imprisoned several times before, because under the law at the time, even avowing yourself as an anarchist publicly was technically a crime. It was sort of like yelling fire in a crowded theater. You're basically threatening to bomb people simply by proclaiming yourself an anarchist. Now, we don't have that on the books now, but that was the way it was construed then. The First Amendment doesn't protect them anarchists because they want to destroy us. Communists, certainly, fell outside of the concept of free speech. And then up through, you get the punk movement, you got hippies, the counterculture in the general sense. Anti-war movements typically are censored. Think about after 9/11 when the radio waves were heavily censored. No Dixie Chicks allowed. Their careers were fundamentally destroyed by the Bush administration. Free Fallin' by Tom Petty was banned off the radio for several years after 9/11 under Clear Channel's guidance, specifically because people were jumping off the Twin Towers and, it's going to bring back bad memories, so you're not allowed to play it. And it was funny because the revisionists will say, well, they weren't technically disallowed. They were just encouraged not to play it. Yeah, the radio jockey is going to not listen to the radio station. The radio station in the time of the FCC headhunting after anyone that did anything they didn't like are totally going to ignore that guidance and risk a lawsuit. Yeah, really, yeah. You're not going to get in trouble, at least not officially. You'll lose your job, but you're not breaking the law. It's not a rule. It's just a really, really solid suggestion. I can remember those days, by the way. And now you go up through the modern counterculture, you could say. Technically, it starts with the Pepe and Keck sort of thing. Meme culture is heavily censored. Look at what big tech is doing. But it's not unique. The biggest unique feature is actually the fact that people can communicate so much more easily. The problem is that that's been monopolized. It's not like 150 years ago, you've got the printing press in your town, but the person who runs it doesn't like you and doesn't want you to print billets there, so you go to the next town. It's not like that anymore. It's more like Google and Apple and a few of these companies are the only printing presses available. So if they all agree that you shouldn't be able to speak, it really limits your capability of speaking. While this should be illegal, and while we need to understand that big tech is the modern public square and we definitely need to tackle that, it's not technically more than vaguely unique as far as censorship is gone, if anything, especially for people with considerable audiences. It would have been much easier prior to the arising of social media. It was easier to silence people. Again, like the Dixie Chicks or any of these other groups of people after 9/11, public figures included, especially celebrities involved with music, the arts, and things like that, have an easier time these days. Basically, the point of this video is not to get blackpilled, though, when you think about it. We've gone through this before, and if you look at each prior iteration of censorship where a subcultural phenomenon is considerably suppressed, communism, anarchism, neo-Confederates, mid-1800s, the punk movement, the goth movement, hippies, every anti-war movement, typically what happens is the censorship ends up collapsing in on itself. The group is never forced out of existence. All of those groups still exist. There are hippies. Not many of them, and living out in the woods. These days they have more guns than just weed plants. There are communists. There are anarchists. We saw much more censorship, for example, in other parts of the world. The Soviet Union, behind the Iron Curtain. Heavy amounts of censorship. And yet all of the censored material's still there. I mean, the books were copied by hand. Cassettes were played over and over, bootlegged until they fell apart. The material never went anywhere. If anything, it meant it was more desirable. If anything, when you censor a group, it tends to potentially make it more powerful. It's very, very rare that the group sort of dries up and dies off. Sometimes they die off specifically because they become accepted by the mainstream and then they're sellouts. Look at punk. Well, there's plenty of punk rockers. Hardly any of them actually follow like the punk ideology. There are plenty of goths around, but it's all like mall goth and shit like that. It's not people going to the Batcave and smoking clove cigarettes at this point. There are hippies. But now, I mean, you can get, Egyptian cotton made in China t-shirt with like hippie symbols and stuff. Oh yeah, tie-dyed shirts. Yeah, man, peace and love. Well, it's all been corporatized. That's the other thing. Subcultural movements that would be unaccepted become accepted in part because they become profitable. You've seen this with the new right to an extent. It's beginning to gain more acceptance. Part of that will have a corporate phenomenon associated with it. But it won't be censored forever. In fact, it'll probably just get more powerful as the result of that. The same is kind of true of the left. The left is muzzled by the neoliberals, but the thing is that they're so boring and everyone thinks so low of them, like Pelosi's approval, what's it at, 22% or something, that by default, basically you just have to exist and allow the lame streamers to want to censor you in order to get more popular. This is, by the way, this is what new tech is doing. Their basic operative procedure, and Gab has said this explicitly, is simply to exist. If you don't get completely destroyed, like, Patreon or something, or VidMe does, if you can manage to maintain, eventually the attacks begin to wane because they're just ineffective. If anything, they just give you more lifeblood, more attention. So yeah, don't get black-pilled. Take the red pill, the happy pill of happy pills. That censorship won't work. It hasn't. Look through U.S. history. Look through Western civilization. The concept that people can speak their minds is more prevalent now and arguably more codified and enshrined than it has been in history, simply because we've completely democratized all forms of discourse. It's like when legacy media sites want to close down comments. Well, they get shit when they do that now, don't they? There's a huge backlash. And if they do it too much, as certain legacy media sites do, people unsubscribe from them and stop following their email feeds and stuff like that, and they go to somewhere else where they can interact with content. It's all very, very fun. That's about all. Peace out.